Well, I heard you groan when we stopped in the middle of the story. Let's talk for just a minute about what is the big picture here. What is the big picture in the Joseph story, in the Joseph narrative? Speak up, I can't hear. God's sovereignty. We have a hard time with this, believing that God has our way planned for us, because it's contrary a bit to the way things appear. Surely we make choices, right? And we make decisions. And if we make a bad decision, one thing happens. If we make a good decision, something else happens. But at the very beginning, remember, Joseph comes to his brothers and tells them about this dream. This dream that he believed was given to him by God, about his whole family bowing down to him, right? Yeah, what could go wrong? Everything. Do you suppose, again, we keep trying to put ourselves into the sandals of Joseph. You suppose that if you had been in this situation where his brothers left him to die, he's finally sold to caravan, taken to a foreign country, accused of immorality, thrown into prison, seems to have a way out, and then the guy forgets about him. Do you think there's the possibility that your faith would be tested? What about now? Is your faith tested? At the end of the month, you've got a lot more bills than you've got money? Or you're wringing your hands over the Republican National Convention? You know that we've made it kind of an unwritten rule. We don't mention anybody's name because we can't find anybody's name mentionable with regard to this upcoming election. But seriously, we look at the future and we say, Lord, what's going on? As Americans, we have not faced in our generations persecution like the other parts of the world have. We've never honestly been faced with a life and death situation on the basis of our own beliefs in God. There are people today who are giving their lives because they refuse to denounce Yeshua. Right? Read about it in Africa. It doesn't make the front page on the paper or on your Facebook or whatever, but it's happening. So why do I say that? So I can scare you into an offering? Shall we take an offering now? No, that's not why at all. It's because if we're honest with ourselves, every one of us face tomorrow with a bit of a tenacious kind of feeling. We're not sure. We would like to be able to be in control of tomorrow. We would like to be able to plan ahead of what exactly is going to happen, but that's not in our power. We come back to this truth that we must put our faith in God. He said, I have your way planned for you, for good and not for evil. Can we entrust ourselves into His hand and therefore today live with the reality that He will have His way and it will be good for us and glorifying to Him? I can remember back when Paulette and I were first married, we when you're young and married and you're just finding out what this marriage kind of love really is, and I mean, like you can face anything with a laugh. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't, You can have 50 cents left to your name and then have a few groceries in the cupboard and just sit there and laugh about it. This is fantastic. But I remember Paulette and I looking at each other and say, how do people exist if they don't believe in God? What do they do? Where do they go? When they're at the bottom of where they thought they could come financially and so forth and so on, things don't seem to be working out, what do they do to face tomorrow? They look for other means. I think a lot of people try to find a way to erase that fear from inside of their head, inside of their heart. They do it through entertainment. They do it through hobbies. They do it through substances. They do it through all kinds of things. They escape from the reality of what they are facing. Brothers and sisters, what we have here in this wonderful, inspired story is a young man, and we're not giving all the details, but a young man who has a faith in God. He never gives up. And we know the end of the story. We've read it too many times to not know it, right? Okay, so I'm not spoiling the movie. What does he say at the end to his brothers? You meant it to me for, but God meant it to me for. Really? God meant the pit for good. God meant the selling. God meant the estrangement from his family. God meant in prison in a foreign country, being misjudged for good. We don't have to try to find a silver lining in everything that happens, you know? When the differential falls off your car on the freeway, you know, you can't stop and say, well, I know that there's something good in this. No, you should get off the freeway first and you should, worry about getting it fixed. Okay, but concern yourself with the immediate. But ultimately, we take this perspective that God has our path planned out. And we say, Lord, help me to see that. Help me to walk in that. And the thing that we hear from the Joseph story is how that worked out for someone that's in the Bible. Well, this week has Joseph weaving a web which will inevitably snare his brothers and force his father, Jacob, to eventually come to Egypt as well. Now, doesn't it bother you, the ethics of this? Was he doing right? Was he doing evil to bring about good? He goes and he says, he has his steward say, why did you return evil for good? They didn't. They didn't put that in their sacks. And then, of course, he puts his divining silver cup. And he says to them, certainly you know that I'm one of these guys that does necromancy and divining. Well, that's what Nachash means. Right?
Why would Joseph indulge in that? Obviously,
I think that's a great question. Will you hold that and we'll work on it? Okay, let's go forward. But the trap into which Joseph's brothers fall has an additional purpose. Joseph wants to see if his brothers have changed. I firmly believe that. In the past, the sibling rivalry had produced a hatred strong enough even to entertain murder. As far as they were concerned, getting rid of Joseph was a political move that eliminated the family heir and put them in line for the inheritance. Now the scenario would be presented to them in which they could just as easily get rid of Benjamin. How they would react to this opportunity would be a true test of their hearts. Is their love for their father strong enough to not allow his heart to break when it comes to Benjamin? Their scheduled lunch meal with Joseph in his own quarters is prepared, and the brothers are led by Joseph's steward to the banquet. By the way, if any of you have a King James Version, anybody reading King James Version right now? No King James Versions? Oh, well, verse 25 is one of my favorites. I think it's 25. Does someone has King James Version? Just read it. Out of the old King James Version. Read it out loud. Anybody? I think it's 43:25. They prepared. They made ready the present against Joseph came at noon. Doesn't that sound to you like a typo? It just reminds us that the King James Version is in an English that we no longer speak. It's just that simple. That's proper English if you were in 1600s. But that's not how we use the word came or against, at any rate. Throughout the ancient Near East, eating together marked status within a culture and even bore signs of covenant significance. The Egyptians, according to the historian Herodotus in his histories, considered the cow taboo. And as a result, why did they consider it taboo to eat? Because they believed it was a goddess or a god. And as a result, refused even contact with the Greeks, who considered the cow a source of common food. Since the Hebrews also raised cows for food, along with the sheep, which were likewise considered unfit for food by the Egyptians, because it too was considered to have some kind of mark of deity, they were looked down upon by the superior Egyptians. In short, the Egyptians viewed the Hebrews as racially and religiously inferior and strictly unclean for social interaction. And even though Joseph was in a place of authority, it still seems possible he was considered a Hebrew. One can only imagine the talk that might have gone on behind his back, though maybe his marriage to an Egyptian may have changed his status somewhat in the eyes of his peers. Regardless, Joseph eats at his own table. It could be that no one was allowed to eat with him that was beneath him. It could have been only the Pharaoh that could have eaten at his table, with his brothers at a separate table and the Egyptian servants and court aides at yet another table. Wasn't that a kind of way to get together and talk? What's going on here? It's still Egyptian culture that is precedent. Here begins a most interesting and important turnabout. At the beginning of the Joseph narrative, his brothers leave him in the pit and prepare a meal for themselves to eat. Remember that? It's like they left their brother out to die, and then they go, let's go eat. Just the opposite has happened here. Joseph prepares a meal for his brothers who had acted as his enemies. Does it remind you of something? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. That rings in our ears. The brothers have carefully prepared their gift for Joseph and lay it out in anticipation of his arrival. What do the Proverbs say? It says that, it uses the word bribe, but I think that's a bad translation, that you can console your enemy with a gift. Right? I mean, we see that happening with Esau. We see that, when Jacob brings all kinds of gifts to him. Guys, when you have really not done well, some flowers and a night out kind of helps a little bit, to open the way to say, will you please forgive me, sweetheart, for my stupidity? Right? Gifts work. Well, they bring their gifts. Yet, in the narrative, Joseph never mentions the gift. He is far more interested in the welfare of his father. His first words are totally a bit backwards. Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? One would expect him first to ask if their father was alive and then inquire as to his welfare. Literally, his shalom. Obviously, if he was well, then he was also alive. The manner in which the questions are asked betrays Joseph's anxious emotion. Even the narrative is written in such a way that he's all tied up. How do I start this conversation? Casting his eyes upon Benjamin, however, raises Joseph's emotions beyond containment. Joseph was overcome with feeling. Literally, his mercies were heated up in the Hebrew. The Hebrew is so picturesque about how things happen. And only tears could bring relief. He therefore hurries out of the room to weep privately. No one's going to ask why he left. You don't ask someone with the power of life and death why he's doing what he's doing, right? Once again, our narrative gives us a picture of Joseph's inner self. Through all of the hardship, he remains a man of mercy. His heart was not hardened by the evil done against him, but remained capable of genuine compassion and love. In our modern society, manliness is characterized as stoic, unmoved, and unemotional. It's the John Wayne syndrome. You bite your lip and just suck it up, and you never let anybody know that you're really moved inside. I had a friend of mine one time come to me and ask if he could talk with me privately. I said, sure, this was years and years ago. And he said, Tim, I have a problem. I said, okay, How can I help? He said, I have not been able to cry for 2 years. I've wanted to cry and I can't. I can't cry. I said, well, is it just that you can't bring tears? He said, no. He said, as soon as I start feeling like I'm going to cry, I tighten up and it just goes away. Well, it was the Lord that cured him of that, because I know he cried. The first time I saw him cry was when I was privileged to conduct the wedding of himself and his bride. Tears do not become a true man, is the way American males think of it. Yet the opposite is actually true. The man of depth and maturity is a man strong enough to weep, a man able to display genuine compassion. And how do we know that? We see this same manly strength in our Master. Overcome by the death of his friend Lazarus, he wept. Remember that shortest verse in the Bible? Yeshua wept. As men, we must dismiss the false picture of manliness presented to us by our upside-down society and reestablish men like Joseph and Yeshua as our heroes to follow. Tender compassion that evidences itself in genuine emotion is a very manly thing. Conversely, the anger that seems to characterize many men in our society is actually a weakness, for it evidences a puny self-centeredness easily exploited by Satan. We all, as men, am I talking too deeply, guys? Sorry. As men, we all know this. It's easy for us to get frustrated. It's easy for us to, this is one of the nice things about working in building something. You find out that when you get frustrated in woodworking, it only goes bad. You have to put it away for a minute, cool down, go back, get the right tool, start over again, do it right this time, so forth and so on. It's easy for us to boil over. It's not so easy for us to be sensitive and show real emotion when it's time. In our story, Joseph needed to cry privately because he could not yet reveal his identity. His hour had not yet come, so after washing his face and regaining his composure, he returns to the place where lunch was being served and gave the command to begin the meal. Obviously, he had instructed the servants regarding the order in which his brothers were to be seated. They immediately recognized that they were seated in birth order, and that puzzled him. Who could have known their ages? Had they pondered that more deeply, they would have found something to fear indeed. The brother they had hated was actually the one in control. They still didn't know this. But not only should the seating order have been an important clue, so also the portions given to Benjamin should have alerted them to what was afoot. He's given 5 times the portions allotted to any of the others. Here again, Joseph is testing his brothers. Would they envy Benjamin for the abundance given to him? The narrative quickly shifts to the time when Joseph's brothers would depart with the food they had come to buy. Once again, Joseph instructs the steward to return the money in each man's sack, but adds something more. His silver cup was to be placed in the sack of Benjamin. Some have read this as though Joseph had actually succumbed to the Egyptian occult and that he had delved into the dark arts of their demonic crafts. But the text is clearly against this. Surely our narrative has made it clear that Joseph retained his faith and allegiance to the God of his father Jacob, right? Moreover, the sacred text never indicates that Joseph actually practiced divination. But in concealing his identity as a bona fide Egyptian, this piece of superstition played well into the scheme he had constructed. His brothers had sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Now a silver cup would be their undoing. I remember going over this in ethics class when I took ethics at seminary. Was it wrong for Joseph to do this? Some people say yes. Well, let me ask you this. Is it wrong to leave lights on at night when you leave your house so that the thieves will think somebody's there? Aren't you fooling them? Aren't you giving them some kind of something that's not true?
You're protecting your own stuff.
You're protecting your own self, okay. What about camouflage? Is camouflage okay? When you're hunting? Say you're out hunting and you put camouflage on. Why do you do that? So the animals will think you're a tree or a bush or something else, right? Isn't that a lie? Is that a lie when you do that? Or how about, this one came up in college actually, how about when you're composing a piece, do you know what I mean by an inversion? Okay, you take a melody and then you invert it and make everything just the opposite, goes down, goes up, so forth and so on, and you put it in the bass line and you put a new melody over the top. Are you really lying to people saying, you don't know it, but I put the melody in a different way here?
You can hear it. Can't
You're
you?
disguising it. Is disguising okay? You have an answer? You have a good answer for us, Derek?
No, I've actually, it's funny you mention this because I remember reading the Gospels and thinking, actually, Yeshua, in a way, does this. He allows people to believe what they want to believe about him,
Right,
but he doesn't ever say he's the Messiah.
right. Well, he does one time.
Yeah, he does.
He says to the woman, the Samaritan woman.
Right.
Yeah.
And he never, comes out, so that he never comes out and says, I'm God, but he says it in every other possible way
Yeah.
you could possibly think of without actually saying it. And
Sure.
scholars call it, the messianic secret.
Yeah.
Because he just won't say it. And
Right.
and he allows people to believe what they want. In fact, even with, in another way, he says in the parables, he says it so that people won't understand.
Right. He tells the disciples, to you I speak in plain words, but to the others I speak in parables, so that hearing they won't hear, and seeing they won't see.
Right, so that he disguises it. And I was wondering, I don't know, maybe this is semantics or whatever, but I'm like, well, is perhaps there a difference between deception and lying? Because, lying is just overtly saying something that's untrue. Deception is just more allowing people to believe something that's untrue, but you aren't.
Yeah. Okay. Let
Forcing
me use
them
this
to-
illustration to see if I can take you where at least my thoughts are going. Have you seen this art? I know I have a book of it somewhere. I don't know where it is, but if you look at the page, a full page of art, and it just looks like a bunch of designs. And then if you look at it long enough, and you look at it just right, out pops a picture. Have you seen those? I don't know what they're called. Now, is that really deception? Or is it the part of the person seeing? If you have the ability to look at it correctly, you see the picture that the artist has written. If you just look at it and gaze at it kind of nonchalantly, you just see a bunch of parts. If his brothers had really been in tune with the heart of their father, if they had mourned the death of Joseph, if they had longed to see him, if they had repented of their guilt before their father and said, we left him to die. It was a lie. We don't know if he's dead or not because that cloak that we brought, we put blood on it from a goat. If they'd have cleansed their conscience with regard to their sin, maybe, just maybe, you really think you wouldn't, as you're in the room, you'd say, have you seen that guy before? He looks familiar, kind of. I can't really place it. Why does he look a little familiar? They couldn't see because their eyes were blinded with their own sin. At least is one way to look at it. When Joseph puts his cup in and then uses the terms, don't you know that I can divine? Now, Joshua Meeks had a comment on that. I saw his hands go up. So I'll let him.
I was going to say it says Kamoni, a man like me. So
Yeah.
he's not saying that he personally does it. He's saying a man in my position.
Yeah, precisely. Right, precisely. Don't you know that a man like me could divine? The Hebrew's ambiguous there. It never says that he did. It only says from your perspective, as you see the picture, don't you think that someone in my position could do this? Well, this is a sticky one. I know, it's a sticky wicket, to use the British term. Of course, we don't play croquet so much, do we? But at any rate, can God close the eyes of some and open the eyes of others? He says that he does. Isaiah says, having eyes they will not see, and ears they will not hear. And Yeshua quotes that when he talks about the parables in Matthew 13. So yes, and that's some would say a fearsome thing, and I agree. When we say yes to God, we can only say that we have been able to do that by His grace. He left heaven to seek us. He went walking in the garden to seek Adam and Chava. He didn't have to go looking for them. He knew exactly where they were. But what were they doing? Hiding. The natural bent of fallen man is to hide from God. There is none that are righteous. They've all gone out of the way. There are none who seek after Him. No, not even one, Paul says, Romans 3. So then how can anybody be saved? God in His mercy, beyond our understanding, without our being able to explain it, has sought a people for Himself, which before time began He gave to the Son. Yeshua said, all that the Father has given me will come to me, and in the one that comes to me I will never cast out. Well, early the next morning, the men depart for home with their animals laden with grain. Having gone only a short distance, the trap is sprung. Joseph instructs his steward to overtake his brothers and charge them with a heinous crime of repaying good with evil. That, of course, has been their crime all along. When Joseph first expressed the divine revelation given to him by the Almighty in the dream, they responded with evil. In this case, the axiom comes true: be sure your sins will find you out. The brothers are dumbfounded. The accusations of the steward are incredible and clearly mistaken. They take an oath: whichever of your servants it is found with shall die. The noose now tightens. Benjamin will be at the mercies of the Egyptian lord. The steward softens the oath by reminding them that justice will be served by enslaving only the guilty one. The rest could go free. Here once again the integrity of the brothers is tested. Would they leave Benjamin in a pit the way they had abandoned Joseph? Apparently not. Rather than abandoning Benjamin, all of the brothers return to await the verdict of their deeds. They know they are innocent of the charges, but they have no power to prove it. Instead, they admit guilt. Or to put it shortly, you can't fight City Hall. Now the tables are turned against him once again. When Joseph had been brought from the prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, he gives full credit to God for the revelation. Here, Joseph plays his role as an Egyptian perfectly. Do you not know that a man like me practices divination? In other words, how could they have reasoned that their crime would remain hidden to one who sees that which is concealed? But Judah's response is, God has uncovered the crime of your servants. That's exactly what Joseph said earlier. God has made the thing known. Now Judah says it. That which is hidden can only be revealed by God. Indeed, God has uncovered far more than they know. Yet Joseph had to be very pleased with their final response. Here we are then, slaves of my Lord, the rest of us as much as he in whose possession the goblet was found. Here, finally, was corporate solidarity, true family, true community. If one was to suffer, all would suffer. Love and loyalty to their father had overcome their self-centeredness and given them the ability to act with integrity toward Benjamin. But Joseph gives one more tug on the rope. Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. Go up in peace. Really? You're coming home without Benjamin? He gives them one more chance for self-preservation at the expense of Benjamin. Had they really changed? Would they portray a heart of hatred or love? Words are cheap. Actions reveal the truth. Judah is spokesman of the brothers, will remain firm in his oath to Jacob. He will be surety for Benjamin regardless of the cost. Something has changed in the years Joseph has been gone. His brothers now consider the welfare of Benjamin as more important than their own. The unity of the sons of Jacob was being forged as the foundation of a nation, to be comprised of 13 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, with Joseph represented by 2 of his sons. It would be this tribal confederation that God would describe as my son, my firstborn, in Exodus 4:22, when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn." Our Haftarah paints a broader picture. Not only will Jacob and his family descend to Egypt, but the nation formed from his family will eventually be birthed through the power of God's almighty redemption. Yet Egypt herself will fall to the power of Babylon. Indeed, Israel will be called upon to decide between trusting in God's power to save or serving Nebuchadnezzar, God's servant, to bring destruction. We know the history of this prophetic word. Israel relied upon man rather than God and was sold into slavery, exiled to Babylon. What is going to happen in the future? Do you think Israel will turn to God? Well, if we read Zechariah correctly, they're not going, I should say we, are not going to turn as a nation to God until such time as we have no other choice. It looks like we get backed up to the sea and the enemies are coming at us full strength. That's what it seems to be in Zechariah 10, 11, 12. And then what happens? Yeshua comes. He says he comes and he fights for them. And they look upon the one whom they've pierced. And they mourn for him as one mourns for a firstborn son. Wow, this sonship just keeps coming up over and over and over again. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. But to as many as received him, he gave them the authority to become what? Sons, children of God, even to those who believe on his name. That's the privilege we have, brothers and sisters. But even as God was with Joseph in Egypt, so he was with his people in Babylon, just as he promised. Israel's faithlessness could not change God's steadfast love. He would bring about his purposes for Israel just as he had planned. I don't understand how people can read and study and even teach the Tanakh and think that replacement theology is anywhere there. How could anyone teach that the church replaces Israel and read all of these portions about God's faithfulness to his people? It's beyond me. Surely the picture of descending to Egypt ties the Haftarah to our Torah portion, for eventually Jacob and all of his family will have followed Joseph to that place. But even more, the fact that God is in control of history, and that's the key point, is clear in both portions. From the famine brought by his hand in the time of Joseph to the control of a world leader like Nebuchadnezzar, the flow of history is not random. It is in the Lord. It is the Lord who is in charge. The apostolic portion was chosen to highlight what our Torah portion teaches about the treasure of one's heart. Joseph stands before us as a supreme example of one who's treasured the ways of God over the grasping of power and wealth. Surely Joseph could have had it all. He was second in command of the largest and wealthiest nation in his time. Yet power and wealth was not his first delight. He treasured the ways of his God. As such, blessing beyond his imagination was his, for he laid hold of an eternal treasure where the moths and rust do not corrupt, and thieves do not break in and steal. He had chosen to serve the Almighty both in poverty and in wealth, and as such, he had gained great treasure. And so we can just conclude with this. Perhaps there is no greater treasure than purity of heart. Purity of heart lets you sleep, lets you awake, puts your eyes forward for the day. Purity of heart is a great, great treasure. A clear conscience before the Almighty allows one fully to enjoy the pleasures of this life with the unfading hope of joy in the world to come. Joseph had learned to forgive and thus had won the battle over bitterness. He had learned the great value of contentment, a commodity available only to those who willingly place themselves by faith in the hands of the sovereign and merciful God of Israel. Well, I don't think we'll ever plumb the depths. We can go over this story so many times, right? Every time we come, if we allowed a little midrash here, don't we see Joseph keeping his brothers in the dark until such time as he decides to reveal himself? And sometimes we wonder, oh Lord, why don't you open the eyes of the nation of Israel now? Now's the time. Well, his time is the right time, correct? Yeah, we just see this picture played out midrashically in so many different ways.